The blacksmith's scarred sister. Hid in the hay, the gentle cowboy combed her hair by lantern. The blacksmith did not know she had left the house until the forge cooled, and the evening stretched longer than it should have. And by then, his sister had already folded herself into the loose hay behind the barn, breath shallow, body tight, hiding not from weather, but from eyes. The scars along her face pulled when she cried, reminders of a fire years past that had taken more than skin. And she learned early that pain drew stares more reliably than sympathy. So she hid where silence lived. The hay smelled of dust and old summers, and she pressed her cheek into it, willing the night to pass without footsteps, because footsteps meant questions she could not answer. She did not hear the cowboy arrive, only the horse settling, the creak of leather, and then the pause that told her someone had noticed something out of place. Lantern light spilled softly through the slats, not rushed, not searching, and the absence of urgency frightened her more than shouts would have. She curled tighter, heart racing, expecting command or correction, but instead the light stopped at a distance, respectful as if it knew where not to go. The cowboy spoke once, voice low and even, saying he was there for the horse and nothing else, and the words mattered because they asked for nothing in return. He tended the animal quietly, movements slow, letting routine anchor the space, and the steadiness loosened something in her chest despite her fear. When the lantern shifted, its glow caught the edge of her hair, tangled and dull, and she flinched, bracing for the moment attention would turn to sharp. It did not. The cowboy set the lantern down farther away and sat where she could see his hands, empty and open, and asked gently whether she was hurt now, not why she was there. The question surprised her enough that she answered without meaning to, shaking her head, the smallest motion possible. He nodded once, accepting the answer as complete, and said the night could be cold in the hay. That lantern light helped keep away what the dark liked to invent. He did not approach until she nodded again, and even then he stopped short, asking permission with his eyes before offering a comb he had taken from his saddlebag, explaining it helped when horses came in tangled from brush. She hesitated, then leaned forward just enough to let the light touch her face, scars and all, and when he began to work the knots free by lantern glow. Careful and unhurried, she realized something had shifted, not because she was being fixed, but because someone had chosen to see her without trying to correct what the fire had already done. The lantern stayed where he set it, casting a circle that did not chase shadows but softened them, and she watched its edge more than his hands at first, waiting for the moment light would betray her. It didn't. The cowboy worked slowly, fingers patient as he eased the comb through snarled strands, stopping whenever it caught, never pulling, never sighing, as if time itself had been given permission to move gently. The sound of the teeth sliding free was small and steady, a rhythm that competed with her breathing until the two began to match, and she realized she had been holding herself tight for so long that release felt unfamiliar. He spoke only to explain what he was doing, not to fill the quiet, telling her where the knot ended and how he would go around it, and the narration mattered because it made the care predictable, something she could follow rather than endure. When the lantern flickered, he adjusted the wick and apologized to the light rather than to her, a habit that made her almost smile before she remembered she had forgotten how. She felt the pull of memory in the scars along her cheek as the comb passed near them, the skin still sensitive, and she tensed without moving away. He noticed immediately and stopped, waiting without comment, letting the pause belong to her, and when she nodded again he continued, changing angle so the teeth never grazed what hurt. The restraint carried its own weight, heavier than reassurance, because it proved attention could be shaped to avoid pain, instead of demanding endurance. Outside, the barn settled, boards cooling with soft pops, and the horse shifted in its stall, a familiar sound that grounded the moment in ordinary life. He asked whether the lantern was too bright, not whether she was afraid, and she shook her head, surprised by how much she needed the light to stay. As the last knot came free, he set the comb down where she could see it, palms open again, and said that was enough for tonight, that too much care at once could feel like pressure even when it wasn't meant to. The sentence landed true, and she felt gratitude arrive without urgency, a quiet thing that did not demand expression. He moved back to his earlier spot and busied himself with the saddle, giving the space back to her without vanishing, and the balance let her breathe. When she finally spoke, it was to ask why he hadn't looked away, and he answered simply that looking away made things worse more often than not. The lantern held, the hay smelled the same, and yet the night felt different because the light had not flinched, and neither had he. And in that steadiness she found room to exist without hiding the parts the fire had already marked. He finished with the saddle and did not leave right away, not hovering and not retreating, choosing a place near the stall where his presence could be felt without being imposed. The lantern hummed softly, its light steady now, and she realized she was no longer counting the distance to the door or rehearsing where she might go next. The hay pressed warm beneath her, and the familiar ache in her shoulders eased enough that she shifted without bracing, surprised by the freedom of the movement. He spoke again only when necessary, mentioning the weather turning colder before dawn and offering a blanket folded over his arm, stopping well short and setting it down where she could reach it herself. The choice mattered. It left agency intact, and she took the blanket after a moment, pulling it around her without being watched. Outside, the night moved on with its usual sounds, wind through boards, a far-off coyote, and none of it felt aimed at her anymore. She asked whether her brother knew she was there, and the question came out smaller than she intended, carrying the weight of habit rather than need. He answered that the blacksmith was still at the forge earlier, and that he would speak to him in the morning if she wanted, or not speak at all if she didn't, and the flexibility settled her nerves because it placed the decision where it belonged. She considered the offer, the scars along her cheek tightening as old memories rose, then said, "Not yet," and he accepted the answer without storing it for later. He told her he would keep the lantern burning until she slept, that it was easier to rest when the dark had edges, and the promise was practical, not sentimental. As the minutes passed, she found her breathing slowing again, the blanket warming where fear had lived, and she watched the lantern instead of the door, trusting its circle to hold. When her eyes finally closed, it was without the sharp start she'd learned to expect, and when they opened again, it was only to see him rising quietly, adjusting the wick, and settling back down, the movement careful not to disturb what had begun. She understood then that gentleness did not ask to stay. It proved itself by remaining available without demand. The night did not rush her away or press in closer, and the hay, the lantern, and the steady presence nearby combined into something unfamiliar and safe. For the first time since the fire, she slept where she had hidden, not because she had to, but because she could, and the choice, small as it was, felt like the beginning of learning how to be seen without being chased back into the dark. Dawn slipped into the barn in thin lines, light catching dust motes and the curve of the lantern glass, and she woke to the quiet certainty that no one had rushed the night away while she slept. The blanket rested where she had pulled it, the hay pressed flat beneath her, and the cowboy was awake already, moving carefully as if the space itself deserved respect. He checked the horse first, speaking low, then turned the lantern down and set it aside, letting daylight take over without ceremony. She watched him from where she sat, not hiding now, only waiting, and the absence of urgency made the moment easier to bear. When he noticed she was awake, he nodded once and asked whether she was warm enough, the question practical and contained, and she answered honestly that she was. Outside, the forge began to stir, a distant ring of metal carrying through the boards, and the sound tightened something in her chest because it meant her brother was near, and morning had brought decisions with it. The cowboy seemed to sense the shift, and said he would stand between the barn and the yard if she wished, or he could step away entirely. And the choice steadied her because it did not force bravery before she had found it. She asked what he would say if her brother demanded she come out, and he replied that he would say nothing unless she asked him to, that some stories belonged to the person who carried them, not the one who witnessed them. The respect in the answer surprised her more than protection would have, because it treated her scars as history rather than evidence. He offered her water and set it down within reach, then busied himself with small tasks, straightening a strap, brushing hay from his sleeve, giving the morning shape without directing it. As the sun climbed, the barn warmed, and she felt the old urge to retreat ease, replaced by a cautious readiness to be seen on her own terms. When footsteps approached, she did not shrink back. She shifted forward, heart steady enough to listen. The blacksmith's voice carried in, rough with worry rather than anger, calling her name, and the cowboy glanced at her once, waiting. She rose slowly, smoothing the blanket as if it mattered, and stepped into the light where the scars showed plainly. The cowboy stayed where he was, present but not between them, and the space he left allowed her to stand without borrowing strength. Morning found her still there, not hidden and not pushed forward, and the balance held, because the night had taught the barn how to keep a promise daylight could honor. The blacksmith stopped short when he saw her fully, the forge's heat behind him, and the softer barn light ahead. And the pause spoke louder than any question because it showed him measuring himself instead of her. She held her ground, shoulders square, scars uncovered, breathing steady in a way that surprised them both, and the steadiness asked for time without demanding forgiveness. He began to speak, then stopped, words catching as he noticed the blanket around her shoulders and the way she stood without flinching, and the interruption forced him to listen before explaining. The cowboy remained a few steps back, hands visible, offering neither challenge nor shield, and the restraint kept the moment from tipping into performance. The blacksmith asked where she had been, voice rough with worry and habit, and she answered simply that she had slept, choosing truth that did not invite argument. He glanced toward the hay, then the lantern set aside, and the details unsettled him because they did not fit the fear he had carried all night. He asked whether anyone had bothered her, and the question landed awkwardly, exposing how protection had often arrived too late, and she answered no, meeting his eyes without apology. The cowboy spoke once, only to say that the night had been quiet and that care had been taken, then stepped back again, returning the center to the siblings where it belonged. The blacksmith nodded, absorbing the information without knowing where to place it, and the pause that followed felt earned, a space where habit loosened enough to let something new breathe. She told her brother she would come inside when she was ready, not refusing him, but setting a line, and the line held because it was spoken calmly in daylight. He opened his mouth to insist, then closed it, realizing insistence would only repeat what the fire had already taken from her, and the realization softened his posture more than argument could have. He said he would put water on and make breakfast, words practical and grounding, and the offer carried weight because it did not ask her to hurry. She nodded once, acceptance without surrender, and watched him turn back toward the house, steps slower than when he'd arrived. The cowboy waited until the blacksmith was out of sight before asking whether she wanted company or space, and she asked him to stay where he was for a moment longer, the request small and complete. He agreed without comment, and the barn settled again, morning sounds filling the quiet with ordinary life. In that ordinariness, she felt a shift take hold. Not resolution, but permission. To choose when to move forward and when to rest. And the knowledge steadied her because it proved that gentleness could teach waiting, even to those who loved her most, but had never learned how to slow down enough to see what she needed. She did not go inside right away, choosing instead to sit on the low crate near the stall while the morning warmed, because moving too quickly would have turned choice into habit again. The barn held its shape around her, familiar and changed, and she noticed how the light fell differently now that fear was no longer steering where she looked. The cowboy kept to his promise, staying nearby without filling the space, mending a strap with motions that had learned patience long before this morning, and the steadiness let her think. She realized the night had not erased the scars, or the years spent hiding them, but it had altered something quieter, the expectation of what would happen when light touched her face. The lantern had shown her that attention could arrive without judgment, and the knowledge lingered like warmth after a fire burned low. When the blacksmith returned with a bowl and set it within reach, he did not comment on where she sat or how long she stayed there, only said it would still be warm when she was ready, and the restraint surprised her because it meant he was learning too. She ate slowly, tasting more than hunger, and watched dust rise and settle as the horse shifted, ordinary movements grounding her in a present that did not demand explanation. The cowboy asked whether she wanted him to leave now that daylight had settled things, and she shook her head, then nodded, choosing honesty over certainty, and said not yet, but soon. He accepted the answer as complete, promising nothing beyond what he could keep, and returned to his work with the same care he had shown her hair. As the hours passed, she felt the pull of the house grow gentler, less like obligation and more like invitation, and when she finally stood, it was without the old rush to disappear. She stepped toward the doorway and paused, turning back once to look at the barn, the hay, and the place where the lantern had stood, understanding that what it left behind was not dependency, but memory, proof that gentleness existed and could be chosen again. The cowboy met her eyes and nodded, a small acknowledgement that carried no claim, and she carried the moment with her as she crossed the threshold. Inside, the forge's heat felt manageable, the noise less sharp, and when her brother glanced up, he did not flinch at the scars because she did not flinch first. The lantern's mark was invisible, but it held, teaching her that being seen did not require endurance, only boundaries, and that care, when offered without demand, could change how a day unfolded long after the light was put away. The day moved forward without forcing her pace, and she realized how rare that was, how often time had been used against her instead of offered, and the difference settled into her like a lesson learned without instruction. Inside the house, the blacksmith worked the forge with care, striking slower than usual, aware of how sound carried, and the consideration mattered because it acknowledged her presence without centering it. She chose a seat near the window where light fell evenly, not avoiding brightness and not seeking shadow, and the choice felt deliberate rather than defensive. When neighbors passed the yard, she did not retreat, only shifted her attention back to the simple task in her hands, discovering that visibility did not always demand response. The cowboy finished his work outside and returned to the barn, preparing to leave, and before he did, he paused at the door and asked whether she wanted the lantern left there for the evening. She thought about it, about how the light had steadied the night without promising anything more, and said yes, but only until dusk, because learning to trust daylight mattered too. He agreed, setting the lantern where it could be found without ceremony, then tipped his hat and went on his way, the departure clean and unclaimed. As afternoon cooled, She moved between rooms with growing ease, the scars on her face catching light without comment, and the lack of reaction taught her something she could not have learned alone. That others often followed the lead she set for herself. When evening came, she lit the lantern briefly, not to hide, but to mark the hour, and the small ritual felt like ownership rather than refuge. The blacksmith asked whether she wanted the barn checked before night fell, habit tugging at him, and she answered that she would go herself later, choosing autonomy without rejecting care. As darkness gathered, she stepped outside, lantern in hand, not to disappear into hay, but to walk its edge, listening to the quiet she had once feared. The barn stood as it always had, familiar and solid, and she realized she could enter or pass it by, and either choice would be hers. She returned to the house before the wick burned low, setting the lantern down with intention, and the act felt like closure without finality. She did not hide again that night, not because fear had vanished, but because it no longer decided where she belonged, and the knowledge settled gently, teaching her that dignity could be practiced, one ordinary evening at a time. Morning brought visitors who did not announce themselves, neighbors drawn by routine more than curiosity, and the yard filled with ordinary movement that tested whether yesterday's gentleness would hold under daylight. She stepped out when she was ready, not early and not late, choosing a place near the fence where she could see and be seen without being cornered. The blacksmith greeted people as he always had, voice steady, hands busy, and she noticed how he did not rush to explain her presence or her scars, trusting the moment to find its own balance. A woman offered a basket of bread and asked where to set it, speaking to her directly, and the respect in the question landed cleanly because it treated her as part of the exchange rather than the reason for it. She answered without shrinking, pointing to the table by the door, and the small authority of the gesture surprised her with its ease. When a child stared too long, the child's mother corrected gently without apology, and the correction mattered because it taught without shaming. The yard adjusted in these quiet ways, learning her pace by watching where she stood and how she moved, and the learning did not demand her patience beyond what she chose to give. She helped with simple tasks, passing tools, tying twine, wiping hands on her apron, discovering that usefulness steadied attention better than explanation ever could. The scars drew looks now and then, but the looks softened quickly, losing their edge when she did not retreat, and the exchange taught her that boundaries could be set without words. By midday, she realized she had not thought about hiding once, not because the urge was gone, but because it no longer offered advantage. The lantern remained unlit inside, a reminder rather than a refuge, and she was glad for it, glad that safety could exist without constant proof. When the cowboy passed the road beyond the fence, he tipped his hat and kept going, honoring the distance he had promised, and the clean acknowledgement left her unburdened. As the sun lowered, the yard settled into its familiar rhythms, and she felt something align inside her, a sense that dignity did not require constant defense, only consistent practice. The yard learned her pace because she set it, and in doing so she learned her own, steady enough to carry into the evening without returning to the hay. By the 9th day, she noticed that her scars no longer entered a space before she did, and the realization arrived quietly, without celebration, because change that held did not announce itself. People greeted her by name now, not always warmly but plainly, and the plainness mattered more because it asked nothing of her face. She moved through the yard with purpose, choosing tasks that fit the hour, discovering that routine dulled the sharp edges of memory better than avoidance ever had. When the blacksmith worked the forge, she stood nearby without bracing, the heat familiar but no longer threatening, and he spoke to her about ordinary things. Orders, weather, a hinge that needed replacing. as if normalcy were something they were both practicing together. The lantern stayed on its hook most evenings, untouched, and she felt no pull to take it down, understanding that tools could rest once they had done their work. A neighbor asked her once about the fire that caused the scars, curiosity poorly hidden, and she answered simply that it was over, then turned back to what she was doing, refusing to let explanation become obligation. The conversation ended there, not because the question was rude, but because she had not invited it to continue, and the boundary held without argument. She realized then that the scars had not disappeared. They had stopped directing traffic. Children approached her without hesitation now, asking for help with small things, and she helped when she could, discovering that usefulness created a language stronger than appearance. The blacksmith noticed the shift, too, not commenting but adjusting his own pace to match hers, waiting when she waited, moving when she moved, learning that protection did not require constant correction. When evening fell, she stood at the threshold and chose whether to step outside or stay in, and either choice felt complete rather than reactive. She thought of the hay, the lantern light, the careful hands that had not flinched, and understood that those moments had not saved her. They had simply given her space to save herself, without pressure. As night settled, the yard quiet and familiar, she realized that the scars had lost their authority, not because others stopped seeing them, but because she had stopped organizing her life around what they demanded. The change was subtle, durable, and her own, and it held as she closed the door and carried the evening forward without looking back. When evening settled on the yard again, it did so gently, without the sharp edge that once sent her searching for places to disappear, and she noticed the change not with relief but with recognition, because fear no longer decided how she entered the night. The lantern stayed on its hook by the door, glass clean, wick trimmed, ready if called upon, and the readiness itself was enough. She did not need to light it to feel its presence. Inside the house, the blacksmith finished his work and washed his hands, the forge cooling into a quiet that no longer felt like warning. And when he asked whether she wanted the door closed or left ajar, the choice landed where it belonged. With her. She chose ajar, letting air move through the room, letting the night exist without being kept out entirely, and the balance felt right. Outside, voices faded as neighbors returned to their own routines, and the yard resumed its ordinary shape, unbent by attention, and the ordinariness carried weight because it had been earned. She stepped onto the porch and looked toward the barn once, not with longing or dread, but with understanding, acknowledging the place where hiding had once been necessary and was no longer required. The memory did not pull at her feet. It settled behind her, part of the ground she stood on rather than a direction she had to face. When the blacksmith joined her, he did not ask whether she was all right, only commented on the weather holding steady, and the simplicity of the exchange confirmed what had changed between them. She realized then that gentleness had not arrived to replace strength, but to teach it a different shape, one that did not depend on endurance or apology. The cowboy did not return, and he did not need to, because what he had offered was not presence that lingered, but care that withdrew cleanly once it had done its work. As darkness deepened, she went back inside and closed the door when she chose, setting the latch without checking it twice, and the motion felt complete. The lantern remained unlit through the night, not forgotten, just unnecessary, and that was the final proof that something lasting had taken hold. She lay down to sleep without planning where to run or what to hide, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew where the light was kept and trusted herself to decide when it was needed. The scars were still there, the world unchanged in many ways, but the path through it felt wider now, because she no longer moved according to what others expected her to endure, and the lantern, resting patiently, bore witness to a truth that needed no glow to be seen. If someone had seen you at your most fragile, Would they have turned away? Or stayed gentle until you could stand on your own? If this story touched you, like the video. Share it with someone who believes kindness can heal without fixing. And subscribe for more Western American tales.